There's a moment, and I think every person who has ever been truly desperate knows this moment, where you stop caring who saves you, where pride becomes a word that means nothing, where the question of who stops mattering entirely and the only thing left is please. The Vilthari did not think they would ever reach that moment. I know this because I was there when they did. My name is Sergeant Dalen Marsh, United Earth Defense Corps, Secondary Fleet, 7th Response Unit. I'm not a hero. I want to say that right away before this story goes any further, because the way people talk about what happened at Selam Station, you'd think we were all carved from some different kind of stone. We weren't. Most of us were scared. Some of us were angry. A few of us, honestly, were just doing the job because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing felt worse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to before the distress signal, back to when we were still the ones being laughed at. Part 1, the weight of the word savage. I joined the Earth Defense Corps at 19. This was 2307, and at that point humanity had been part of the galactic conclave for approximately 41 years. 41 years of trying to be taken seriously by civilizations that had been sailing the stars, while our ancestors were still carving things into cave walls. The Vilthari had been spacefaring for over 12,000 years. Let that land for a second. 12,000 years. When humans were still figuring out that the sun didn't orbit the Earth, the Vilthari were already mapping the outer arm of the Milky Way. When we were sailing wooden ships across our own tiny oceans, they were establishing trade routes between star systems we hadn't even named yet. By the time we got to them, they had a word in their language, Velka, that roughly translated to the child species. The ones that hadn't grown up yet. The ones that needed supervision. That word was applied to exactly 3 species in the recorded history of the conclave. One of them was humanity. I found this out on my first day of fleet orientation, from a Vilthari liaison officer named Sethris, who had drawn the short straw of welcoming the new human recruits to joint operations training. He was tall, they're all tall, the Vilthari, somewhere between 7 and 8 feet, with a kind of lean gray-blue elegance that made them look like they'd been designed rather than evolved. 4 arms, 2 primary and 2 secondary, the secondaries thinner and used mostly for fine work. Eyes that caught light in a way that made them look perpetually condescending. Or maybe Sethris was just condescending. He walked the line of about 30 of us, mix of Americans, Indians, Brazilians, Nigerians, Koreans, Poles, and he looked at us the way you look at something you've been asked to babysit that you're not sure is house-trained. Then he said in that flat, perfect, translation unit-refined English that all the senior conclave officers used, "You will find that the Joint Fleet operates on principles of discipline, coordination, and measured response. Humanity has shown capability in limited engagements. We expect you to observe and learn." He paused, then he added, "Do not touch equipment you have not been cleared for. Do not speak during formal briefings unless addressed. And under no circumstances should you attempt to modify standard-issue gear. We had an incident." I raised my hand. I know, but I raised my hand. "What incident?" I asked. Sethris looked at me for a long moment. "A human engineer disassembled a Korathi targeting array to improve the site radius. It required 6 months of Korathi diplomatic time to explain that we had not done it intentionally." The Korathi delegate 2 rows down from us made a sound that was probably laughter in their species. It sounded like gravel being poured. I lowered my hand. That set the tone, pretty much for everything that followed. The Vilthari weren't alone in it. The Korathi had their own flavor of contempt. The Merav were just openly bored by us. And the Serenthi, who were the most ancient species in the conclave and looked like living coral reefs that had learned to float, simply didn't acknowledge us most of the time, which might have been their version of polite. But the Vilthari were the most vocal about it. They ran the Joint Fleet. They ran most of the conclave's military operations. They were the ones humans interacted with most, which meant they were the ones we had the most opportunity to irritate, and boy, did we take that opportunity. It wasn't always intentional. We fixed things. That was a big one. Humans just fix things. Someone in the Earth Defense Corps sees something that's broken or inefficient, and they start pulling at the threads of the problem before they've even thought about whether they're supposed to. I watched a private from Lagos named Amara Okafor spend 45 minutes rewiring the climate control unit in our shared bunk bay because it was cycling too slow, and she had it working 30% more efficiently before any of us noticed what she was doing. She was disciplined for it. The climate control system was Velthari engineered. Officially, the charge was unauthorized modification of joint fleet equipment. But the room was warmer, and she kept her modifications. We made noise. The Velthari ships ran quiet. It was a cultural thing. In their society, loud and boisterous behavior was associated with youth and low status. They communicated in tones that barely registered as speech to our ears. They moved through corridors with this careful, deliberate stillness that made you feel loud just by breathing. And we were human. Corporal Jaisu Yun used to beatbox in the maintenance corridors when he was bored. Private First Class Rodrigo Castellano sang football songs during late-cycle kitchen shifts. Me, I used to drum on things. Tables, railings, my own legs. It drove the Velthari insane. There was a Velthari lieutenant named Commander Veth who once stopped me in a corridor and stared at my hands. I'd been tapping a rhythm on my thigh without even realizing it, and said, "You do not appear to be aware that you are making sound." I said, "Sorry, sir, habit." He looked at my hands for another 2 seconds, then he walked away. 3 weeks later, I found out he'd written a behavioral notation into my personnel file. Not a disciplinary report, just a note, like he was cataloging a bird that kept doing something unusual. We were curious. That might have been the biggest one. Velthari curiosity was a measured thing. It was directional, purposeful, contained. They asked questions when they needed information. Humans asked questions because something was interesting, or because they wanted to understand, or just because the silence felt wrong and a question filled it. I had a habit of wandering into any open lab bay I passed and just looking at whatever was in there. Not touching, usually, just looking. It got me stopped by security on 4 separate occasions. On the 5th occasion, a Velthari senior research officer named Tessave actually stopped and asked me what I was looking for, clearly expecting some ulterior motive. I said I just wanted to see what was in here. She stared at me for long enough that I started to feel genuinely uncomfortable. Then she said, "You wanted to see." "Yeah." Another pause. "There is nothing in this lab that pertains to your assignment." "I know, I just noticed the door was open." She stared a little longer, then she stepped back and let me in. I don't know why she did that. I never understood it. But for the next 4 months, whenever I wandered past her lab and the door was open, she'd give me a kind of nod that I chose to interpret as acknowledgement, if not exactly welcome. That was the most complicated relationship I had with a Velthari in 3 years of joint service. The contempt wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was right out in the open. There was a diplomatic convening at Threshold Station, one of the big conclave neutral ground platforms that sat at the edge of Velthari territory, and I was part of the human security detail. This was about 8 months into my joint service, and we were guarding a trade delegation. Boring work. Stand in formation, look professional, don't knock anything over. A Merav trade official walked past our formation and said something to his colleague. The translation unit caught it and fed it to the earpiece of Lieutenant Carla Esperanza, who was commanding our detail. I saw her jaw tighten. After the official passed, she told us what he'd said. He said the conclave lets them pretend now. It's more efficient than explaining why they can't. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Private Ademi, youngest of us, 19, from Ibadan, said quietly, "I hope he needs us someday." And then we went back to standing in formation, because that's what you do. The mockery wasn't universal. I want to be fair about that. There were individual Velthari, Korathi, even a few Merav who treated us as colleagues rather than mascots. Commander Veth, who noted my tapping habit, never actually treated us with contempt. He just treated us with what I eventually understood was his version of caution. He'd seen new species come into the conclave before. He was careful. That was different from dismissive. And there was a Velthari junior officer named Ale. Full name was something I couldn't pronounce. She told us to use Ale, who'd spent 2 years at a human university on Earth as part of an exchange program and came back with an understanding of us that most Velthari never developed. She used to say when the subject of humanity's primitive nature came up, "They are not primitive. They are new. There is a difference." She was the only one who said things like that, and usually only to humans who could hear. But even she, even Ale, would not have predicted what happened at Selam Station. None of them would have. Part 2, the distress signal. I need to explain Selam Station before I tell you what happened there, because if you don't understand what it was, you won't understand what it meant that it was dying. Selam Station was the largest Velthari installation in what they called the Outer Sovereignty, a cluster of systems in the mid-arm that they'd held for about 3,000 years. It was part habitat, part research outpost, part military staging point, and part monument. The Velthari built things to last. Selam Station had been operational for 840 years. It was beautiful. I'd seen images, this enormous structure that looked almost organic, like something that had grown rather than been built, with sweeping lattice structures and bioluminescent panels that made it glow blue-gold against the darkness of space. It held approximately 83,000 souls, Velthari mostly, some Korathi researchers, a small Merav trading delegation, a few dozen Serenthi who were there for reasons nobody had fully explained, and this is important, about 412 humans, scientists mostly and their families, plus a small diplomatic team and about 60 Defense Corps personnel. A joint assignment, one of the conclave's many gestures toward integration. In 2312, 5 years after I'd joined the Corps, 3 months after I'd been assigned to the 7th Response Unit aboard the human carrier Persistent Margin, Selam Station sent out a distress signal. I was in the mess hall when the alert came through. Lieutenant Esperanza was eating 2 tables down. We looked at each other and she said, "That's the priority band." Priority 1 conclave distress signal, the kind that meant immediate response from all capable vessels in range. We got to the bridge in 4 minutes. Captain Irin Solano, 40-something, from Buenos Aires, short silver hair, built like someone who had never in her life been unsure about a decision, was already at the command console. The signal was playing on the main display. It was fragmentary. Selam Station's long-range communication array had been partially destroyed by whatever had hit them. What we were getting was a repeating automated pulse. Essentially, the station screaming "help us" in every direction simultaneously, and hoping someone was close enough to hear. "What happened to them?" I asked Esperanza. "Don't know yet," she said, still pulling data. What we got over the next 20 minutes was pieces of a picture. Selam Station had been struck by what appeared to be a dredge swarm. I need to take a breath here before I explain this, because even now, years later, the dredge make me feel something cold and basic and deep. The dredge were not a civilization. They were not a species exactly in any way that the conclave understood. They were more like, and this is the only analogy I have that works, they were like a force of nature that had learned to move with purpose. They came from deep space, from beyond the mapped regions, and they consumed everything: ships, stations, asteroids, anything with usable mass and energy. They didn't communicate. They didn't negotiate. They had no interest in anything except resource acquisition, and they were terrifyingly, unthinkingly efficient at it. The conclave had encountered them twice before. Both times had been catastrophic. The second encounter, 30 years before I was born, had resulted in the loss of 2 Velthari systems and over 1 million casualties. After that, the conclave had established a dredge monitoring network, an early warning system designed to give sufficient time for evacuation if a swarm was detected. Someone had either missed the signal, or the dredge had come faster than predicted. Selam Station had a dredge swarm on top of it, and they were dying. Captain Solano put out a request to Conclave Command for coordinates and response authorization within 6 minutes of receiving the signal. We were 3 hours from Selam at best speed. Depending on how far the nearest Velthari fleet units were, we might be the first response ship in the area, or we might arrive to provide backup to a response already underway. What we got back from Conclave Command was not what we expected. The first response was a 40-minute delay, which was already wrong. Conclave Emergency Protocol specified a maximum 20-minute acknowledgement window for Priority 1 signals. Then the response came: signal under review, stand by for authorization. Solano stared at the screen. She said very quietly, stand by for authorization. Ensign Park, our communications officer, young, very precise, always professional, said, "Captain, it's a Priority 1 distress. That's automatic." "I know what it is, Park." She wasn't sharp with him, she was just thinking. She tried again, requested the authorization directly, formally, with full core identification and citation of Conclave Emergency Protocol Article 7. Another wait, this one was 35 minutes. Then, human vessel persistent margin, your request is noted. Response coordination is in progress. Secondary fleet vessels are advised to await assignment. I was standing near the back of the bridge. I watched Solano's back. I watched her take one long breath. "What's the Velthari fleet doing?" she asked. Ensign Park pulled up the positioning data. The nearest Velthari fleet was the 3rd Sovereignty Wing, 8 ships, full battle complement, and they were not moving. "Why aren't they moving?" I heard someone say. It might have been me. The answer took another 2 hours to come through, and it didn't come from Conclave Command. It came from Ale. She was stationed on Threshold Station at the time, part of the diplomatic liaison team, and she used a personal channel, which was technically against protocol, to send Solano a voice message. I was in the room when Solano played it. Ale sounded carefully controlled, the way the Velthari always sounded when they were containing something larger underneath. She said, "Captain Solano, I'm sharing this outside official channels, and I will deny I did so if asked. The 3rd Sovereignty Wing has not deployed because the Fleet Admiral has determined that the dredge density makes a direct intervention non-viable at this time. They are waiting for the swarm to thin. Standard protocol in high-density dredge contact is to preserve fleet assets and intervene after the primary wave recedes." She paused. "I am aware of what this means for the station." Another pause. "I am aware that there are over 400 humans on Selam Station. I don't know if that changes your calculus." Then the message ended. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Then Solano said, "How many of our people are on Selam?" Park said, 412 personnel and dependents. "And the total station complement?" "Estimated 83,000, with variable current attendance, possibly 60 to 70,000 aboard given recent deployment cycles." Solano nodded slowly. "Estimated dredge density." "Based on signal degradation and partial sensor data," Park hesitated. "High, possibly the largest swarm since the 2280 incident." "Survival probability if we go in now." He hesitated again. "I don't have a good model for this, Captain. We'd be the only ship." "I didn't ask about us. I asked about Selam Station." "Without intervention," Park looked at his screen. "At current dredge consumption rate, the station has maybe 9 to 12 hours before structural integrity fails, maybe less if they hit the reactor systems." 9 hours, 12 if they were lucky. Solano turned around. She looked at the bridge crew, at Esperanza, at Park, at the helmsman and the weapons officer and the half-dozen others who were watching her. Then she looked at me, which surprised me because I was just a sergeant standing near the back. But she looked right at me for a second, like she was checking something. Then she said, "Plot a course for Selam Station, best speed." Park said carefully, "Captain, we haven't received authorization." "I know we haven't. Plot the course, Ensign." He did. Part 3, Into the Swarm. Here's something I want to tell you about going into a dredge swarm, because I don't think the word terrifying quite covers it. We'd trained for dredge contact. Everyone in the Defense Corps trained for it. Simulations, protocols, defensive arrays, emergency response procedures. I knew in the abstract what a dredge swarm looked like on sensors. This spreading, rolling density of signal returns that moved with an organic, almost fluid coherence. Individual units no bigger than a ground vehicle, but swarming together in numbers that defied easy counting. On the simulation screens, they'd looked almost beautiful in a horrible way, like murmuration. You know, starlings, the way thousands of them move together in the sky, but bigger and metallic and alive in a way that made your skin crawl. In person, through the viewport, they were something different. They were dark. The dredge were dark in a way that felt intentional. They absorbed light rather than reflecting it, which made them nearly invisible against space itself, except for the faint energy signatures they threw off when they were actively consuming. You'd see a star, and then you'd realize the star wasn't there anymore because something was between you and it. You'd see the edge of Selam Station in the distance. It was still glowing, blue-gold, still lit up even while it was being eaten, and between you and it you'd see the movement. The rolling, purposeful, patient movement. There were thousands of them. Lieutenant Esperanza was standing next to me near the observation bay, and she said very quietly, "Okay, that's a lot of them." "Yeah," I said. "We're still going in." "Yeah." She nodded, "Good." Solano's plan was, and I mean this as a compliment, entirely human in its approach. Which is to say it was improvised, aggressive, somewhat mad, and fundamentally based on the theory that if you were loud and fast and unpredictable enough, things that couldn't think would struggle to adapt to you. The Velthari, when they engaged dredge swarms, did so with methodical precision. Grid patterns, systematic elimination, measured advance and withdrawal. It was tactically sound against smaller swarms or spread-out encounters. Against a density like this, the Velthari fleet had looked at the math and decided the math didn't work. Solano looked at the same math and decided to use different math. She pushed the persistent margin in at full speed, not cautious approach speed, full combat speed, using the ship's mass and velocity as a kind of wedge. Behind us, we were pulling every piece of emergency equipment we had. Rescue craft, tethered extraction pods, 3 modified cargo shuttles that our engineering team had spent the 2-hour approach converting into dredge-resistant short-range transports by the simply insane method of welding additional armor plating over every surface that didn't need to move. That was Amara Akafer's work, by the way, the same private who'd rewired the bunk bay climate control. By 2312, she was a staff sergeant and the head of our engineering team, and when Solano said, "I need those shuttles hardened," Amara had looked at the available materials and said, "Give me 2 hours," and then just went and did it. The dredge responded to our entry the way they responded to everything. They noticed us. The ones nearest to our path began to shift, beginning the slow reorientation that preceded an attack run. But we were moving faster than their typical targeting cycle. The first wave came at us and most of it missed, and what didn't miss skittered off the hull in a way that was terrifying to hear but not immediately catastrophic. Most importantly, we punched through to within shuttle range of Selam Station. I want to tell you about the first shuttle run, because this is where the story stops being about the big picture and starts being about individual people, and I think individual people are where the truth actually lives. I was on the first shuttle. There were 12 of us in that first run, 4 crew, 8 soldiers, plus Akafer herself, who had flatly refused to stay on the carrier, and had told Solano that she needed to be on site because she didn't trust anyone else to make real-time engineering calls. Solano had stared at her for 2 seconds and then said, "Fine, you're on the first shuttle." The shuttle was loud. The additional plating made it rattle differently, gave every impact a different, heavier resonance. The dredge hit us 3 times on the approach to the station's emergency docking port, and each time the shuttle shuddered and my stomach tried to be somewhere else, and each time the hull held. When we docked, the station was, I'm going to take a moment here, the station was not what I expected. I'd expected panic. I'd expected chaos. In my mind, 80-something thousand people under dredge attack was screaming and running, and all the horrible chaos of a disaster in progress. What I found was a different kind of terror. The organized, exhausted, desperate kind. The kind that looks like people who have been fighting for hours and are running out of things to fight with. The Velthari, and this is one of the things I carry with me from that day, one of the things I think about when people try to make the story simple. The Velthari on that station were not cowards. Their own people were dying. They were working. They were managing evacuations, shoring up internal bulkheads, trying to keep the life support systems functional. They just didn't have rescue. The fleet wasn't coming. They were on their own with whatever the station had, and a dredge swarm doesn't care about your internal fortitude. The station coordinator who met us at the emergency dock was a Velthari named Lethvar. Tall even by Velthari standards, gray-blue like all of them, but with this quality of stillness that I later understood was shock. The stillness of someone who's been running too hard for too long and has hit the wall of themselves. He looked at our shuttle. He looked at the 12 of us in our core gear with our equipment. He looked at me. And he said in that translated unit English, "You are human." "Yes, sir," I said. He looked at the shuttle again, then back at me. "You are the only ones who answered," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't gratitude yet either. It was just the statement of a man confronting a fact he hadn't prepared for. "Yes, sir," I said again. "We've got capacity for a first evacuation run. What's your critical priority list?" Part 4, the work. What followed was 11 hours that I'm going to try to describe accurately, knowing that accurate probably won't be enough. The persistent margin made 9 runs, 9 shuttle trips into the station, loading civilians, children first, then injured, then non-essential personnel, working down the triage list that Lethvar and our own Lieutenant Esperanza put together in the first 40 minutes while the rest of us were already moving. The 3 hardened cargo shuttles ran constantly, Akafor rotating between them to manage the wear the dredge were putting on the hull plating. The dredge were everywhere. They'd penetrated the outer ring of the station by the time we arrived. We moved through corridors where the outer walls had been breached and patched with emergency sealant, transparent, gelatinous stuff that you could see through, and through which you could see the dredge on the other side, pressing, testing, looking for weakness. It was, the closest thing I can compare it to is working in a building during a flood. The water is just on the other side of the glass, and you are very aware that the glass is not going to last forever. Private Jaisu Yun, the one who used to beatbox in the maintenance corridors, had the idea of using our core sound equipment to broadcast interfering frequencies into the sections where the dredge were densest. The dredge communicated partly through vibrational signals. If you could disrupt that, create enough static in their frequency range, they became less coordinated, less efficient. This was not standard protocol. This was Jaisu having read a technical paper about dredge communication patterns 3 years earlier because he thought it was interesting, which was exactly the kind of thing that used to drive the Vilthari insane about us. It worked. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but enough. In the sections where we deployed the sound interference, the dredge pressure dropped by maybe 30%. It bought time. It bought evacuations. Lethvar watched Jaisu set up the equipment. He didn't say anything. His expression and reading Vilthari expressions is hard. They're not built like us, but you learn after enough time was something I could only describe as recalibration, like he was updating a model that had been wrong. Corporal Ademi, Private Ademi back at Threshold Station, the youngest of us then from Ibadan, was in charge of one of the evacuation corridors, managing the flow of Vilthari civilians toward the shuttle dock. Vilthari are tall. The corridor was designed for them. Ademi is 5'7". He was running back and forth like a sheepdog in a corridor full of animals twice his size, keeping the flow moving, keeping people calm, physically supporting injured individuals who were struggling. He speaks 4 languages fluently and was picking up enough Vilthari in real time to give instructions in their own tongue by hour 3. I saw a Vilthari child, young, small, genuinely terrified, separated from what I assumed was their family in the press of the evacuation, and I watched Ademi stop, crouch down to eye level, and say something in broken Vilthari that made the child look up instead of down. Then he picked the child up, asked around until a family member responded, and passed the child over before going straight back to managing the corridor. It took him maybe 4 minutes. He never stopped moving. He just folded that moment in and kept going. Amura Akafor in hour 7 made a call that I still think about. The portside shuttle dock was taking dredge pressure. The outer wall was showing stress fractures in the sealant. If it went fast. The dock could be sealed, saving the structural integrity of that section of the station at the cost of stranding about 200 people on the wrong side of the seal. She didn't seal it. She went to the other side of the seal with a welding kit and 3 of her engineers and spent 90 minutes reinforcing the sealant from outside while the dredge were still pressing on it, and they got all 200 people through before it finally went. When she came back through, the wall failed behind her by approximately 4 minutes. I told her afterwards she was out of her mind. She said that wall had at least 2 more hours in it. I did the math. I said it had 4 minutes. She said so I was off. The math was close enough. Captain Solano was coordinating the whole thing from the persistent margin, which was itself under constant dredge attack. I didn't have eyes on the carrier during most of those 11 hours. I was inside the station, but I heard about it afterward from Ensign Park. The persistent margin should not have survived. One ship alone in that swarm density, conducting stationary-ish rescue operations rather than maneuvering freely, should have been overwhelmed within 2 or 3 hours. They weren't, and the reason they weren't is that Solano never stopped moving the ship. She kept it in constant motion, not evasive random motion but purposeful. She developed a rhythm to it. a pattern that kept the dredge always slightly behind where they needed to be to get a sustained attack on any one section of the hull. She also, at hour 4, did something that was completely unauthorized and technically a violation of 3 separate conclave ordinances. She broadcast the dredge frequency interference on the persistent margin's main array at maximum power, not just locally. She aimed it at the main body of the swarm. She hit them with the biggest version of Jisu's trick she had available. It didn't stop them. Nothing was going to stop them, not one carrier. But it rattled them in whatever way things without brains can be rattled. It disrupted the coherence of the swarm at the local scale, made them less coordinated than they would have been, made the attack pattern on the carrier less focused. It probably bought us 3 or 4 more hours. Later, this was much later in the conclave inquiry. A Vilthari fleet analyst would look at the frequency data and say, very carefully, that the tactic had no basis in established doctrine, but had nonetheless been effective within parameters that doctrine had not anticipated. That's the Vilthari way of saying, we didn't know you could do that, but you did it. Part 5, the VALTHARI fleet arrives. At hour 9, the 3rd Sovereignty Wing jumped in. 8 Vilthari warships, full combat complement, dropping out of FTL at the edge of the Selam system. The swarm density had thinned, not because the dredge had left, but because enough of them had been distributed across the station that the outer space density had dropped to what the Vilthari fleet had determined was viable intervention range. By hour 9, we had evacuated 37,000 people from Selam Station. Let me be clear about the math here because the math matters. At the time the Vilthari fleet arrived, we were on Shuttle Run 8. We were exhausted. The shuttle hulls were taking real damage. The persistent margin's outer defensive layer had been eaten through in 3 sections. Our soldiers inside the station were running on stimulants and spite. We had moved 37,000 people. There were still somewhere between 20 and 25,000 on the station. And then the Vilthari fleet arrived, and 8 warships worth of evacuation capacity and combat capability came to bear on the swarm, and the calculation changed. I was in Corridor 7 of the station's mid-ring when the announcement came over the station's internal communication system. It came in Vilthari first and then in translation. Those of us inside didn't have our translation units calibrated for Vilthari, so we were relying on the station's own system. The announcement said the Vilthari 3rd Sovereignty Wing had entered the system and was engaging the swarm, and that evacuation operations were being expanded. I was sitting on the floor of the corridor. There are no photographs of this moment, which is fine, because I'd rather you not know exactly how I looked. My back was against the wall. I had a water pouch in one hand. My boots were held together with emergency sealant tape because one of the dredge microunits had gotten through a gap and done something to the fastening mechanism that I hadn't had time to address properly. My hands were shaking, which they'd been doing for about an hour, and I was choosing to attribute that to caffeine and not anything else. I heard the announcement and I said out loud to nobody in particular, "About time." And Corporal Yun, who was sitting 6 feet away doing the same nothing I was doing, said, "You know they're going to write reports about this. Conclave inquiry. The whole thing." "Yeah," I said. "They're going to want to know why we went in without authorization." "Yeah." He thought about this for a moment, then he said, "Worth it." "Yeah," I said, "it is." The Vilthari fleet was efficient. 12,000 years of civilization-level military experience is 12,000 years of military experience. And when they engaged with a precision and power that was genuinely something to witness even at the tail end of an 11-hour nightmare. They cleared the outer swarm in the time it took us to complete our 9th run. By hour 12, the dredge pressure on the station was dropping fast enough that the station's own internal teams could start reclaiming sections they'd sealed off. The final evacuation count, across all runs and all vessels, persistent margin and the 8 Vilthari ships, was approximately 62,000 survivors. The dredge had consumed or destroyed an estimated 18 to 21,000 people before we reached them. There's no version of this story where the numbers feel okay. I want to be clear about that. 62,000 people lived. 18 to 21,000 didn't. The Vilthari fleet's delay, the decision to wait for the swarm to thin, is something that the Conclave spent years examining. I'm not going to put a verdict on it here. I wasn't in the room where that decision was made. I don't know what they saw on their sensors or what models they were running. All I know is what I saw from inside the station, and what I saw was the consequence. 62,000 people lived, and for 9 of the 11 hours they were being evacuated, the only ship between them and the dredge was a human carrier. Part 6, what happened after? There was an inquiry. There's always an inquiry. The Persistent Margins crew was formally cited for unauthorized response to a distress signal pending fleet authorization, unauthorized use of experimental frequency interference tactics, and 3 specific instances of unauthorized equipment modification, Ockafer's welding work, primarily. These were not small citations. In conclave terms, they were serious. Captain Solano stood in front of the conclave military review board, 12 senior officers, 10 of them Velthari, 2 Korathi, and she listened to the charges. Then she said very calmly, "The station had between 9 and 12 hours of survivability when we arrived. We arrived in 3 hours. Every hour of delay was approximately 2,000 to 3,000 casualties. We made the decision to respond immediately. I would make the same decision again." The room was quiet. Then the lead Velthari review officer, a fleet admiral named Tessavar, who I later learned was Tessave's elder sibling, the research officer who'd let me look around her lab, said, "The Persistent Margins' actions were in violation of standard authorization protocol." Solano said, "Yes, sir." The Persistent Margins' actions resulted in the survival of an estimated 20 to 25,000 individuals who would otherwise have died before fleet intervention. "That is our estimate, yes, sir." Fleet Admiral Tessavar looked at the board. Then he said, "The charges are noted for the record. No punitive action will be taken. The Persistent Margin and her crew are commended for exceptional response under emergency conditions." He paused. "The Conclave Emergency Protocol will be reviewed to clarify authorization procedures in high-density dredge contact scenarios." That was all he said about it officially. But something else happened, something smaller and quieter and in some ways more meaningful. 3 days after the evacuation, I was on Threshold Station. The Persistent Margin was in dock for damage repair, and we'd been moved to temporary quarters. I was in one of the station's common areas, which were always uncomfortable because Velthari furniture is designed for Velthari, and I was trying to eat something that was technically food without thinking too hard about what it was. Lethvar came and found me. I hadn't seen him since the evacuation. He'd been part of the last group off the station. He'd stayed until he was sure there was nobody left reachable, and he'd been brought off on the Persistent Margin's final run. He looked different now in the way that people look different after things that change them. Still tall, still gray-blue, still that quality of careful stillness, but it was a different stillness now. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of someone who had touched something he didn't have words for yet. He stood in front of me for a moment. I stood up because it felt wrong to sit while he was standing. He said, "You answered." "Just that." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "We said," and then he stopped himself, tried again. "There are things said in the conclave about your species, about limitations." He stopped again. "I said some of those things at one time." "I didn't say anything." "I want you to know," he said, "that I understand now that I was wrong." It was the most formal and most painful kind of apology, the kind from someone who doesn't have a lot of practice with it, but is doing it anyway because it's the right thing. I recognized it because I'd given a few of those myself over the years. I said, "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." He nodded, then he said, "The child in Corridor 4, the small one who was separated." I thought about it. I didn't manage that. That was Corporal Adami. "Adami," he said, as if filing the name somewhere. "I would like to, there is no word in my language for this that translates well. We have a concept, Velshin, which means the formal acknowledgement that a debt of honor exists which cannot be fully repaid. I would like to extend this to your crew." I was quiet for a second. Then I said, "Sir, if I can say so, Corporal Adami would tell you no debt is owed. He'd say he was just doing his job." Lethvar looked at me. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what makes it a debt." Ale found me the next morning. She came to find me specifically, which told me she'd been tracking where I was, which was both slightly alarming and very Velthari. She had a formal document with her, a conclave communication, sealed and stamped. "This is from the Survivors Coordination Office," she said, "a formal testimony record." 62 of the Velthari survivors specifically requested it be created. I looked at the document. What does it say? It is, she said carefully, a correction to the official conclave cultural assessment of humanity, filed by 62 citizens who were aboard Selam Station. She paused. It is not the first time citizens have filed corrections to cultural assessments. It is, however, the first time a correction has been filed referencing a specific incident as the basis for the revision. I looked at the document for a long moment. I couldn't read it. Velthari's script is intricate and completely opaque to me, but I could see that it was substantial. Pages of testimony. Will it matter? I asked. Ale was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when she was thinking about how honest to be. Then she said, some things change through policy, through debate, through formal revision. She looked at the document. And some things change because 62 people wrote down what they saw with their own eyes and filed it where other people could read it. She handed me the document. I thought you would want to know it existed, she said. I held it. It was heavy in the way that paper, even Velthari paper, which is more like a dense polymer film, is heavy when what's on it matters. Tell Corporal Adami, I said, and Staff Sergeant Akaffer and Corporal Yun, they deserve to know more than I do. Ale nodded. I will tell all of them. She turned to go. Ale, I said. She stopped. You said 2 years ago when people talked about us, you used to say we weren't primitive, we were new. There was a difference. She turned back slightly. I said that. You were right. She looked at me for a moment with those light-catching Velthari eyes. Then she said, I knew I was right, I just did not know if I could prove it. And then she left. Part 7, What the Mockery Cost Them. I'm going to be honest about something that I've been thinking about ever since that day, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story worth telling. The mockery, the Velka, the child species designation, the looks and the citations and the comments that our translation units caught and that people like Lethvar made, and that the Merav official at Threshold Station made, it didn't just cost humanity dignity. It cost the Conclave information. It cost them something real and practical. If the Velthari fleet had known what humans could do in a dredge scenario, they might have factored our capabilities into their response planning. If the Conclave had invested in understanding human tactical thinking, which is adaptive, improvised, frequently irrational in form, but rationally grounded in outcome, they might have protocols that looked different. Jaisu's frequency interference trick was in a paper written by a human researcher. It was in the Conclave academic database. Nobody had applied it to field doctrine because the humans who knew about it weren't in the rooms where doctrine got written. The Velthari fleet delayed 9 hours waiting for conditions to be viable for their style of engagement. A human crew didn't wait, used a different style, made it work. I'm not saying we were smarter. I'm not saying the Velthari were cowards. I'm saying that 12,000 years of institutional thinking had built walls around what was possible, and sometimes it takes someone who doesn't know the walls are there to walk right through them. We didn't know we couldn't, so we could. The Conclave did change after Selam Station. Not dramatically, not all at once. Institutions don't work that way, and 12,000-year-old institutions work that way even less. But there were changes. Human officers were included in dredge response planning for the first time, not as observers, as contributors with a vote. Commander Veth, who had put that behavioral notation in my file years earlier, became one of the architects of a new joint doctrine that specifically incorporated human adaptive response tactics. I don't know if he remembered my tapping habit when he wrote those sections. Maybe, maybe not. Akaffer was offered a position in the Conclave Advanced Engineering Division. She turned it down. She had her own people, she said, meaning her crew, but she accepted a consulting role that meant Conclave engineering teams could request her expertise. She spent the next 6 years essentially teaching Velthari engineers how to improvise, which she described as the most frustrating and rewarding thing I've ever done. Jaisu's frequency interference paper, not his own paper, the one he'd read, was formally incorporated into dredge response doctrine. Jaisu himself was given a commendation. He stood there looking slightly embarrassed and said, I read a lot. The Velthari officer giving the commendation looked uncertain what to do with this information. Adami, who had, as I predicted, told Lethvar he was just doing his job, spent 3 years as part of a new joint cultural exchange program, working specifically on human Vilthari integration. He is, as of the last time I checked in with him, one of 3 humans in the history of the Conclave to hold a Vilthari Velshan acknowledgement. The other 2 were also from our crew. And me. I went back to doing what I did. Sergeant Dalen Marsh, UEDC, 7th Response Unit. I served another 12 years after Selim in various posts, in various situations that I might tell you about sometime and might not. I'm retired now. I live somewhere quiet, which is what you want when you've spent 20 years in places that were very loud for very bad reasons. People ask me about Selim Station sometimes. Not often, it's been a long time, and the galaxy has had other crises since then, and memories are short even when they shouldn't be. But sometimes someone reads about it, or they're doing a history report, or they just heard something and want to know what it was actually like. I tell them it was 11 hours of the worst and best version of the people I served with. I tell them it was 62,000 people who lived. I tell them about Lethvar standing in front of me on Threshold Station, saying you answered like it was still a fact he was working to contain. And I tell them, because I think it's the most important part, that the Vilthari didn't become our enemies for mocking us. They didn't need to be punished for it. They just needed to be wrong, and eventually they were, and then the ones who could admit it, admitted it. That's more than you get from a lot of species. The formal report on the Selim Station incident is about 3,000 pages, most of it technical and tactical. Somewhere toward the end, in the section on human crew conduct, there is a line that one of the Vilthari review officers apparently insisted on including. It reads, "The persistent margin crew operated without established protocol, without authorization, without comparable precedent, and without apparent regard for the statistical probability of success. Their actions were consistent with no known model of fleet behavior. They were, by every assessment, not supposed to succeed." And then, below that, in the formal conclusion section, they succeeded. I keep a copy of that section framed above my desk. Not because I need the reminder that we were there. I know we were there, I lived it. I keep it because sometimes, in the years since, when something new and enormous and seemingly impossible sits in front of me, when the walls around what's possible feel very solid, I read those 2 sentences. They were not supposed to succeed. They succeeded. And I remember that 12,000 years of being told something is impossible has never, not once, made it actually impossible. It just made it ours to do.